Neopian lore, what we got in store. Talking about the things that we love and adore. We're all over 20, right? We stay indoors and play this game. And love this game. Sometimes hate this game. But let's all talk about Neopian lore. Yeah! Woohoo!
Welcome to episode 25 of Neopian Lore. We're talking about Werelupes this episode, and I know many people refer to them as lupes instead of loops because of the spelling. I hear you. I understand you. Elefante apparently isn't pronounced that way. It's elephant. I'm sorry, but how lame is that? And I recently learned that it's not Feofin, it's Peofin. Yeah, no. That pronunciation just makes me think about little kids peeing in the pool. Ugh! I'll try to be as accurate as possible and attempt to pronounce all names correctly, but keep in mind this world is fictional and this is all just for fun. I'm your host, Krista Poyman. Now let's cozy up to some nostalgia. When the moon is full and you hear howls in the distance, you best run and find cover, for the Werelupes are out. And if they find you, well, let's just hope they don't find you. Werelupes are bipedal creatures with sharp claws and are extremely muscular like a human bodybuilder. They have fur that comes in an array of colors: brown, red, gray, blonde, black, etc. Ripped clothing, specifically flannel or denim, is a must. Apparently, Werelupes are not allowed to have tailored clothing, which is a downright shame. Just because they are bigger Neopets doesn't mean they don't deserve well-fitted clothing. It sounds like a great business to get into and an untapped market. Perhaps Prig Pants and Swarthy Tailors in Neovia can get on that. Most Werelupe sightings are in the Haunted Woods, the woods outside of Meridel, and the outskirts of Altador. While Werelupes have were in their name, alluding to werewolves, they are more like wolfmen. A werewolf shifts from human to wolf, typically during the full moon, but a wolfman is static, forever in their wolf humanoid stage. The loop part of their name refers to lupin, which is Latin for wolf. One becomes a Werelupe if bitten or scratched by one, though it's unclear if a Neopet needs to be a loop to turn or if they can be any species. And not every Werelupe bite transforms the Neopet bitten, as you'll hear later, but we're not exactly sure of the parameters. So what's up with the moon? Though they don't transform during it, there's still evidence that some of their power derives from the moon. Perhaps they do have a transformation of sorts, but not nearly as drastic as a human to a wolf. There is the item Haunting Eclipse Moon, description, "Looks like there's a full moon tonight. You would better watch out for Werelupes." To better support this, a majority of images that feature Werelupes have a prominent full moon in them. There is a handful of art of Werelupes strolling in the sunshine, but it just feels plain wrong. It gets sticky when we talk about true Werelupes versus the loops painted Halloween. While Halloween loops do look like Werelupes, they are not necessarily cursed. Some are simply wearing a costume. We've got the square rectangle conundrum, or what I prefer, the toad-frog conundrum, meaning all toads are frogs, but not all frogs are toads. Insert Werelupes and Halloween loops into this equation. There is a drastic difference between unconverted and converted Halloween loops. Unconverted are bipedal with the classic Werelupe physique, while converted are quadrupedal with the standard loop shape. If you do happen to own a Halloween loop and look at their pet lookup, you gain an avatar with the Werelupe King on it. The Werelupe King is as he sounds, the mighty king of the Werelupes. He was seen in the PlayStation 2 game, The Darkest Fairy. His character was voiced by Bob Joles, and he has an impressive list of voice acting credits. He's most famous for voicing Man Ray in SpongeBob SquarePants, but also has credits in shows such as Chowder, Danny Phantom, and games like Final Fantasy, Kingdom Hearts, and World of Warcraft. Good for you, Bob. The hero of the game, a knight named Tormund, was dispatched on his first mission. The Werelupe King and his army had infiltrated Illisen's Glade and must be stopped. The squadron rushed over and was attacked by Werelupes, capturing all the knights except Tormund. He found the Werelupe King just as he swiped at the beloved Earth Fairy Illison, her crashing to the ground.
Get away from her!
This is the best Meridel has to offer. You're barely a mouthful.
I said get away.
I don't have time for this. Novice, 2 bones.
Instead of fighting his own battles, the Werelupe King sent out Nophis. I love that his name has gnaw in it, like a dog gnawing on a bone. I would argue that Nophis was more terrifying than the Werelupe King. This giant creature was a red werelupe with 4 arms, each with a shackle and chain which he used to swing at his enemies. Nophis was chaotic and unpredictable and destroyed anything in his path. His Neopedia page says the following: practically impossible to control, even by the Werelupe King himself, Nophis generally has one thing on his mind: destruction. Most of the time he remains chained up deep within the Werelupe burrows, locked behind a very heavy wooden door. But on rare occasions, he's allowed to come out and play. While not much can be said about his social graces or skills as an eloquent speaker, Nophis does have a unique ability for combining power, agility, and mild insanity into one devastating combination. Though many would label him a mindless monster, others insist that that is an unfair assumption and prefer that he be referred to as wickedly deranged. Generally speaking, if you encounter Nophis during your travels in Neopia, it's probably best to just turn and run. Hopefully, you'll make it. The Werelupe King kept his champion locked deep underground, which is super messed up. Keeping him in isolation like that of course would rile him up and make him this chaotic ball of anger. Poor thing just needed some compassion. Tormund didn't fare too well against Nophis. The hero was thrown to the ground, Nophis ready to make the final blow. But in the last second, the eldest of the knights came to the rescue, slicing back the beast. But then, the Werelupe King snuck up behind the old knight and bit him on the neck, and he collapsed to the ground. Spoiler alert, this old knight is none other but King Altidore in disguise. Gotta respect a king who will fight his own battles.
Come, we must leave quickly before...
You, more than most, should know never to turn your back on your enemy.
No!
Novice, quit playing with your food and kill him!
Now you must be wondering, if King Altidore got bit, is he now a werelupe? It is fascinating that King Altidore is a loop to begin with, but as of now, he has shown no indication of being transformed. He is a bigger, muscular character, but that is because he was a knight. If he is a werelupe, he's hiding it really well. So King Altidore was down, which left Tormund to finish the job. Since Nophis's element was fire, the way to defeat this creature was Tormund had to use a water mote on his sword. This quickly disposed of Nophis, but gave the Werelupe King enough time to steal Illison's prized charm and disappear into the shadows. At this point, there was a detour in the game. Tormund teamed up with Princess Roberta, a sorcerer in training. They cured a plague, learned information about the Darkest Fairy and her plans of conquering Neopia, lots of things going on here. But let's fast forward to the second Werelupe section. Tormund and Roberta headed to the Werelupe Woods, as they needed to retrieve Illison's charm to break down a magical barrier. They ran into the ever-lovely Sophie the Swamp Witch, who told them of a secret entrance into their burrow, a vast system of tunnels. The duo were attacked by many Werelupe minions, and Tormund and Roberta were separated. Tormund finally reached the Werelupe King, him surrounded by his pack.
Well, what have we here? Looks like some fresh meat. Hello, meat. Anyone here know what we do with meat?
Stew 'em! Boil 'em! Stick 'em on a skewer and roast 'em over an open fire!
You're that morsel from Illison's glade, aren't you? Well... Ooh, looks Looks like we're having 2 for dinner. But let's do a little tenderizing first.
The Werelupe King was a large, black-furred werelupe with tan patches on his chest, face, and tip of the tail. Around his neck was the infamous Werelupe Claw, a high-end Battledome item found in the Hidden Tower with a base price of 8 million Neopoints. The claws around his neck are his own. Quote, "The Werelupe King howled in pain. When it grows back, it will be twice as sharp." Ugh, that grosses me out so much. Imagine pulling out your own fingernail. Ugh, so gross. Somehow, Werelupes gain power from these necklaces, either psychosomatic, they feel like they should gain power from them, so they do, or they contain actual power. The Werelupe King also wore bands of either claws or teeth around his arms, and a piece of skull atop his head, showing how much power he has compared to the other Werelupes. Even the Werelupe King's throne is made of bone. I have a hunch the skull piece was of an Ixie raider, as it is horned and they're an enemy of the game, probably of a leader or one higher up to be more of a status symbol. Tormund and the Werelupe King fought in intense battle, the Werelupe King using a bone boomerang that doubled as a sword. Howls and cheers came from the pack over epic battle music, but with a swing of his blade, Tormund sliced through the Werelupe King. According to Werelupe rules, the one who defeats the leader is now technically in charge, but Tormund released Roberta, grabbed the charm, and ran off, as the other Werelupes scattered. Supposedly, the Werelupe King and Novice are dead, and we haven't seen them since the game. Are the remaining Werelupes still a mega pack? Did they break off into multiple packs, or are they all solo? Which, fun fact about real wolves, being a lone wolf isn't as uncommon as one might think. This is known as dispersing. Many wolves leave in the fall and early winter after sexual maturity to start their own packs, as packs are mostly family units. Dispersing helps diversify the gene pool and to keep areas from becoming overcrowded. The current leader could also be the Werelupe Sage, who was the Werelupe King's advisor and resident mage. A Werelupe with magic? Yeah, it's pretty cool. It is implied that the mage was the one truly in power, maybe even the one who could control Novice, as his TCG card says, "Only he knows who the dark power controlling the Werelupes really is." The mage carried a staff with a skull mounted on it, resembling one of a Werelupe. How metal would it be if the skull was of the last Werelupe King, and then when one dies, he replaces it with the most recent one? If there is still a mega pack, the sage could be the Werelupe King, or he could have another puppet in his stead. So why would the Werelupes work with the Darkest Fairy? Well, Werelupes work on a much smaller scale than what she was after, total control of Neopia. She could use them to further her plans in exchange for a piece of land. They're an easy group to make a deal with because both sides are powerful and neither would likely mess with the other. That's not to say that if she got further with her plans, she wouldn't betray them if she had something to gain and a window of opportunity, but it didn't seem likely. Now, there are 2 honorable mentions that I'd like to think are Werelupes, but haven't been confirmed nor denied. The first is Balthazar, a loop who was a fairy bounty hunter, trapping and bottling them for monetary gain. Armed with only a tightly woven net, a few empty bottles, and a sharp, toothy grin, Balthazar stalks and watches his prey through a camouflage of leaves and shadows late at night. The fairies, unaware of Balthazar as he enters their precious realm, stand guard in the trees. Balthazar cleverly cloaks himself in their midst, becoming a shadow among them, a dark ghost. They don't hear or see him, as they are all carelessly fluttering about, as fairies often do. Suddenly the hair on his back rises, his eyes turn red, his sharp teeth reflect the moonlight, and with a leap and a swoosh of his trusty net, he bags several prize fairies at the same time. The lucky ones flee as fast as they can to the top of the trees. They can only look on and wonder who this beast is. As he turns to go, he stops and looks up into the trees that are twinkling with the fairies that escaped his net. "I prowl through the darkness, hunting all of you. There's no use hiding. Your fate is sealed in my bottles." Let's look at the evidence, shall we? First and foremost, he's a loop, so we've got that covered. He's also bipedal and fairly muscular, and, as his Neopedia article says, he only hunts at night, and his eyes change to red when he is on the hunt. A few of his Battledome weapons could also be proof. He has the item Supersize Gargantaplex, an item to literally change into a larger version of oneself. He also fights with a Balthazar claw, and as we know with the Werelupe King and his followers, the claw of a Werelupe holds great power. I would also like to point out the ridiculousness of his item Bent Fork, which makes all opponents' weapons with fork or trident in the name unusable except Bent Fork. It's absurd and I love it. If you wish to fight him, his difficulty levels are 320, 480, and 640, so not beginner friendly. Balthazar does have a tragic backstory, yet it doesn't excuse his horrid actions. His Gallery of Evil page says the following. Balthazar the Loop was abandoned by his family on the edge of the haunted woods as a child. He crawled, hungry and thirsty, through the twisted forest until he came upon a clearing. He could see purple lights in the distance, dark fairies. As he asked for help, they started to giggle, and then to cackle, and all of a sudden, they started picking up stones and twigs and threw them at the poor Loop. Balthazar had no other choice but to run away, yelping and crying. He somehow managed to survive in the woods, living for years alone, and he never forgot what the fairies did to him that day. First, shame on those parents. How horrible can you be to abandon your own son at the edge of the woods? And it's disappointing that his first interaction with fairies were with dark fairies, known tricksters. No wonder he has such a jaded perception of fairies. He needed help and was granted none. If you obtain a bottled fairy, releasing it will grant your pets Battledome abilities. Balthazar's bottling business is so successful and in demand, he even has a stock with the description, "A very dark and mysterious company indeed. They work underground, popping up when people least expect it and stealing fairies, bottling them, and then selling them on." Why anybody lets these people on the stock exchange is beyond most people. The more I think about the character Balthazar, the more terrifying he is. He's taking sentient creatures and trapping them in a confined space. Picture yourself locked in a room the size of a bathroom stall with practically nothing to do. Literally, all you can do is stare outside the glass and think. The idea of being trapped in a bottle for years with no inkling when you'll be released is absolutely horrifying. During the fairies' rune plot, where the fairies were turned into stone, even bottled fairies weren't safe. While inside their confinements, they remained in their normal form, but released, they would immediately turn to stone. Which, to be honest, being turned to stone seems a better fate than being trapped in a bottle. At least in theory, the stone fairies weren't aware of their situation. And Balthazar took advantage of this with delightful glee. Quote, Balthazar rubbed his eyes and edged up to the nearest statue, an air fairy frozen mid-giggle. He nudged her almost gently, as if afraid it was all a joke. The stone did not budge. The Loop swallowed and said hoarsely, "There are no more fairies?" Balthazar grinned and thumped the air fairy statue with a fist. She fell over into the grass with a clunk. "Woohoo!" he shouted. After doing a victory dance around the petrified fairies, Balthazar came back. "I'm going home," he announced. "I'm going to hold a bottled fairy opening party." Balthazar most recently made an appearance during the 2023 Fairy Festival for the Free the Fairies Neocache event. Users could purchase slingshots to release the fairies in exchange for wearables. At the conclusion of the event, Balthazar tried to trap Illison as she was in a weakened state. Normally, Balthazar can't trap the more powerful fairies, so this was a dream come true for him. But Illison had a trick up her sleeve and had just enough power to break out, and her, alongside Jadora, apprehended Balthazar, and he is now currently in custody. Who knows what his fate shall be? Illison truly has had a lot of difficulties with the Werelupes, but she does know how to outwit them, as according to the book Illison's Illusions, description, a fun tale of how Illison outwitted some Werelupes by using some fairy magic, she has defeated them before. Balthazar has many other significant appearances on the site. He does what he calls the Balthazar Mega Fairy Giveaway Bonanza, where he donates 100 fairies to the money tree, typically daily around 7 a.m. Neopian Standard Time. During Caption Contest 797, we see Balthazar putting a tiny Dr. Sloth in his Happiness Fairy getup into a jar, which is confirmation enough for me that the Happiness Fairy is indeed real. The image for Caption Contest 690 is also a doozy, and I would love an explanation. Picture this: Balthazar in a frilly pink dress with a matching bonnet, hosting a tea party with a tied-up tooth fairy and air fairy. Is he capturing fairies because he wants to be like them, not because of some childhood trauma? Dude, if you want to wear frilly dresses, you can live that dream. Don't take it out on the fairies, just be yourself, man. There used to be an inflatable Balthazar in the Battle Dome, similar to Punchbag Bob. He had 1 hit point, and people would use him for testing out weapons and healing. Balthazar also has an official Neopets account with 2 pets, a Werelupe named Minion of Balthazar, and a royal boy Cybunny named Sir Fluffsalot. The juxtaposition is glorious. Now you must be thinking, man, catching fairies must work up an appetite. And you'd be right. Not only is Balthazar a menace to the fairies, but pets too. In the games Extreme Herder and Extreme Herder 2, Balthazar is the enemy. Your job is to round up pets and place them in a pen before Balthazar eats them. I know Neopets are technically animals, and animals do eat each other, but it just feels so wrong on a virtual pet site. All those poor Noils, Babas, and Dogglefoxes. They're too innocent to be eaten. No wonder there was a Balthazar Unappreciation Day on October 21st, 2010. He is a menace. The second Werelupe contender is Bruno, a blue galert from Neovia who is featured in the Tale of Woe plot, which I'll go more into detail in a designated episode. While Bruno is a galert, his design and backstory check the rest of the Werelupe boxes. Bruno was a shy galert and had a crush on an Aisha named Lily, but she unfortunately had a boyfriend. A mysterious croc offered a potion that would make all his dreams come true, garnering Lily's affections. I know it's not nice to woo a girl if they already have a partner, but he was young and naive. We'll give him a pass. Bruno drank the potion, and it worked! He gained the muscles he desired and wins Lily's heart, and even told others about the potion. But it didn't last long. Bruno became a disfigured and grotesque monster, as did others in Neovia who drank the potion. The slimy croc slipped off into the night, and anger was directed towards Bruno and his family. Bruno defended his home to allow his siblings to escape. Then he fled himself into the woods, where he stayed in a cave for 10 years before being discovered by the plot's protagonist, Gilly. The two break the curse on Neovia, but for whatever reason, the cure won't revert Bruno back. He accepted that he would remain in his cursed form, and returned to Neovia to live with his family. Oh, poor Bruno. He was just a misguided kid, and someone took advantage of that. I love Bruno as an example of a Werelupe, or I guess Weregalert, because he aligns us good. Werelupes aren't inherently bad, but there's this social pressure to it. With the Werelupe king, he was turning others to build an army. I doubt they had any choice in the matter, resulting in dire consequences if they didn't follow his orders. Let's just hope all those Werelupes out there get shown much-needed kindness so they have a change of heart. Just be careful, though, so you don't accidentally get eaten. Well, that's all for this episode of Neopian Lore. All characters and licensing belong to Neopets.com. Music was created by me, Krista. This episode's composition is called Welcome to the Haunted Woods. I hope you have a howlin' day in Neopia.